Support for this podcast comes from Troy University, dedicated to teaching a new generation to lead change. Information on leadership opportunities available to students from day one is at troy.edu/leadchange.
From Troy Public Radio, this is Alabama Aloud. I'm Don Noble. Alabama Aloud is the only podcast where you can hear Alabama stories read in their entirety. To kick off Season 2, I'll be reading The Good Thief by Ravi Howard. Ravi Howard was born in Montgomery and lived for many years in Mobile. He is the author of the novels Like Trees Walking and Driving the King. Set in an Alabama prison, The Good Thief describes the cooking of a condemned man's last meal. The story, The Good Thief, was first published in Alabama Noir and is read here by permission of the author. For his final meal, all Thomas Elijah Raymond asked for was the cake, the one he remembered from Rachel's luncheonette in Phoenix City. Prison rules would not allow food brought in from the outside. Safety concerns. So if Rachel Walker said yes, she would have to come to Holman on the day of the execution and make it there. How to feel about such a thing? Reluctant, but somehow compelled. When the day arrived, the warden's assistant greeted Rachel and escorted her to the kitchen. She could now match a face to the familiar voice she'd heard so many times over the phone in the few weeks before. "Mrs. Walker, the warden will be here in just a minute. Can I get you anything in the meantime?" Francine asked. "No, thank you. I believe I'm fine." Rachel wanted to sound more certain and to dismiss any worry on her behalf. She wanted to manage that on her own. As Francine disappeared out the swinging metal doors, Rachel watched her through round windows. The secretary walked past the corrections officer stationed outside and made her way down the corridor. The sound of her heels on the concrete was muted by the thick steel doors that had by then stopped swinging. Rachel was alone now, in the newly constructed wing of Holman Prison. It was the biggest kitchen she had ever seen. The smell of her restaurant kitchen had always given her comfort. It was not the smell of any particular dish, but instead the slow, thin layers built up over the years. There was always cinnamon near, even if it wasn't needed for a recipe. Bowls of it curled like scrolls used to write down histories. She wished she had brought some with her. This place smelled of bleach and ammonia. It whispered nothing. Stainless steel shelves lined the freshly painted walls. Ceiling lamps spread a dull glaze across the metal fixtures. Fluorescent bulbs gave a uniform pale, except for a single lamp that flickered, blinking rays the color newspaper turns. A dozen parallel steel islands rose from the white tile floor, wrapped in thick blue plastic pulled taut over narrow shelves and secured around the edges of the counters. 2 adjacent counters had been uncovered and arranged for her use. Francine said that the new wing had been finished just a few weeks ago. The men would arrive soon, and from this kitchen they would be fed. In the meantime, the warden had arranged for her to work here. According to Francine, the warden thought the space would be ideal, out of the way, clean. Rachel had dressed for a warm autumn evening. She was not prepared for the cold confines of the prison kitchen. It seemed the temperature was set for a space full of toiling and heat, so the cold air, unchecked, was too much. The place wasn't walk-in cold, but damn near, with air washing over her feet in waves, snaking around her ankles and running along the floor. She placed her purse on the counter and removed a black apron. Rachel's luncheonette, 35 years in the baking, in silver lettering. The silver blouse beneath her black suit matched the silver in her hair. This was how she dressed for the events she catered. Yet she had taken pause when readying for this occasion. There was no proper dress for preparing a last meal. She'd made the 3-hour drive alone, told her family she was driving to Atmore for the weekend. Her daughter and son-in-law were busy running the kitchen, had been for years. A few days a week, she would walk the dining room and the lunch counter, speaking to the first-timers who had her cookbooks, had seen her on television here and there, and she greeted her regulars as well, trying to dole out the same welcome to any and all. She could come and go, be there without being there, her face on the menus and the sides of buses and the coffee bags and cookie tins they sold in the gift shop. So, when she told her family she had a small job in Escambia County, a repast for an old acquaintance, she'd saved herself the strain of a lie she may have to remember later. The truth itself was troublesome enough. The prison kitchen was empty except for the ingredients. Francine had requested them a week before. Shortening, sugar, molasses, salt, baking soda, and flour had been lined up in a perfect row, labels turned outward. Someone had seen fit, perhaps an eye for detail, but certainly a nod toward normalcy in a place where there was too little. On a nearby table sat an antique mixer. In the kitchen of a prison, the comforts of home seemed strangely out of place. She flipped the power switch on the mixer, and the familiar hum rang out. She remembered having a similar one years before. Its heavy body and thick insulation produced a hum unlike the rattling of the new ones that cost more than they should. Chrome, as beautiful as it could be, was hard to keep clean. Working folk had no time to worry about fingerprints and smudges. The matte metal about the kitchen reflected indistinguishable masses of light and dark, but in the chrome she could see herself. She examined her reflection in the mixer's oblong body, getting closer to it until the moisture of her sigh obscured her image. With one of the neatly folded dish towels, she wiped the chrome clean. It was my mother's. She had barely grown comfortable in the silence when his voice rang out. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you, Mrs. Walker. I'm Lionel Peters, the warden here. I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to meet you previously." He walked over to greet her, but waited for Rachel to extend her hand first, an old-fashioned stance that she hoped would fade. Indeed, Lionel Peters looked a few years her junior. Set in his ways, she was sure, but he carried himself a little older than he was, and his clothes didn't help. His suit surely had the right cut and hang before the years settled into it. He was conscious of his posture, but the slouch in his jacket remained. "Did Francine offer you anything when you came in? Excuse me if she didn't. We can forget our manners working in here. Can I get you something? Coffee or anything?" She offered, but I didn't need anything. "Well, everything you asked for is right there on the counter. Your perishables are in the refrigerator over there. The ovens are behind you. Officer Earl will be right outside. Holler if you need anything. He can escort you to the facilities if you need to use them. I apologize, we didn't build a ladies' room on this end. You sure I can't get you anything? Coffee or something?" She shook her head. "What else?" the warden said while flipping through a deck of papers on the clipboard he tapped against the counter. "I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh yes, the list. I want to make sure we got everything. Shortening, eggs, sugar, cocoa, flour. There is one thing. I realized much too late that I left something off the list. My vanilla syrup. We make our own to sell in the gift shop, so I'm just so used to having it around and not buying it. Coming down here is a little out of the ordinary, to say the least, so clarity has been a little challenging." She knew they had rules about bringing things in, but she prayed they could look the other way. The warden was killing a man, and he had made a show of this little bit of kindness, so certainly he would see fit to say yes. She took from her bag a bottle and set it down gingerly, almost like a beg your pardon for it being there against the rules. The bottle rested between them, and the warden walked a bit closer and turned it so the label faced outward, like the rest of the ingredients. He smiled a bit then, looking from the label to her, the pattern in the design the same as the embroidery on the apron she carried. Good branding. Her smile in the photograph was clockwork, perfected after years of showing her teeth because she had to, and then because her enterprise made it worthwhile. I understand. I got no qualms with it, considering. He was decent enough, but Rachel could tell the warden wanted no part of this. The letter in 2 places said he would understand if she said no. She could just send a recipe, and they'd honor his wishes. But if she'd said no, she would still know Thomas Elijah Raymond's execution date, and she would probably look at the clock well aware of the hour. She would have wandered there in her mind, even if she had said no to making this drive. "We pick a fine time to pay attention, don't we?" she said. Rachel was looking away, but the edge to her voice was unmistakable. The warden said nothing. She paused before she spoke again. "Nobody looking after him for years, and he's got all kinds of eyes on him now. More this evening, I suspect. Spectators. Witnesses, the family of the victim." He pressed the clipboard flat against his waist, a stance that seemed automatic. "He doesn't deny what he did. I'm thinking about what we're about to do, me and you both. Trying to wake up and go about my business tomorrow and thinking back on this here." A hand on the counter then, like candor, needed a different sort of balance before the words came freely. "You'll probably feel worse about this tomorrow than you do today. I always do." "Why do it then?" she said. And there they were, on the other side of the nicety. She saw in the warden a decent man, but maybe that was part of the problem. What decent folks were willing to go along with. He was quiet for a minute, and he breathed in and out with too much intention. He glanced away in a room with no windows, and he seemed too accustomed to conjuring some good memory, a little daylight stored away for days such as this one. The ease in his face said as much. "My wife reminded me this morning that we ate at your place a while back. We were on our way to see some of her people in Tuskegee. Enjoyed it immensely. Just a good meal on a good afternoon. I didn't mention it to Raymond, because it's rude to reminisce on things, get casual with the outside world. Do you remember him?" She shook her head. "So many kids over the years, it's impossible to say." "Well, in any case, you're appreciated." "Please tell your wife I said thank you. To you as well. Like you said, it doesn't sit easy, so, well, thank you." It was quiet for a while again, except for the lights and the freezers, and the sound of Lionel's wedding band against the countertop, a little sonar to bring him back to whatever was next on his clipboard. "You sure I can't get you coffee or something?" "No, thank you. You've done just fine with the mixer." The warden excused himself then, and as he made his way down the corridor, the metal doors swung to silence. Rachel was alone again, her mind holding vigil. She had lied to the warden about Raymond. How could she not remember? The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or so, because she remembered him sitting at the table with what looked like his grandparents, coloring the children's menu with the Crayolas she passed out in sardine cans. His family was on the way to Huntsville, the Space Center, they said, and he had lined up the salt and pepper shakers, the Louisiana Hot, and the Heinz bottle as rocket ships taking off from the tabletop. To get dessert, he had to promise to finish the green beans, alone on the plate where the chicken had been, the wing and drumstick reduced to gristle and bone. He chewed with purpose, but not enjoyment, like he was practicing handwriting with his jaws. But the booth they chose was across from the cake display, so he did a bit of window shopping while he finished the last of the beans. Rachel was on the other side of the glass, loading the shelf of red velvets. She remembered him studying his options. He didn't like the green beans one bit, but he'd kept his word and intended to make the most of it. He asked for the molasses cake, while his grandparents had red velvet and buttermilk pie. They thanked Rachel as they left, and then she looked away and didn't see the boy fall to the ground. A child on the floor raised no alarm at first. Kids were prone to go from dilly-dallying straight to sprinting and stumbling, and the tantrums. But something was wrong, because when Rachel finally noticed the boy on the floor, his eyes were widening as he struggled to breathe. In the commotion, his people thought he was choking, but there didn't seem to be any obstruction in his throat. He held his mouth wide open, still searching for air. Rachel got to the boy first, the allergy syrup from the first aid kit in hand. He coughed up the first dose, but she gave him more while his grandmother rocked him, his grandfather fanning with a napkin. By then, the boy was breathing easier, and the gentle wheeze faded a bit. After taking several deep, full breaths, the boy cried some and peered around. He hadn't lost consciousness, but his eyes looked beyond them, apparently seeing nothing. Then he finally recognized them, Rachel, his grandparents, and it seemed he had to lock eyes on everyone gathered around him to fully return to the world. And then it was over, the scare behind them. Rachel was always careful about nuts and other common allergies, but the boy's reaction to molasses was a rare occurrence. People like to sue over such things, but these folks sent her a letter of thanks. She would find out later that the grandparents were guardians, new to his care, and they had known about his condition. She wondered then about his parents. What tragedy or rift had brought him to the care of his elders? It was a blessing to discover his condition in caring company. Beneath the cursive of the grown-up handwriting, the boy had signed his name, Jojo. In what she read about him during his trial, she discovered that his grandparents had died. He had made his money as a day laborer, and Thomas had killed a man who refused to pay him. He had gone through the victim's pockets for the money he was owed. Murder in the commission of a robbery. There would be no clemency. As part of the death decree, the state of Alabama would use 3 chemicals for his lethal injection. After the first drug, he would lose consciousness. The second would shut down his muscles. The third would stop his heart. What Rachel carried in her bottle would do the same, answering the young man's request for a final and private mercy. All he asked for was the cake, like the one that showed him what his body could not take, what in the right dose might knock him unconscious or even kill him. Molasses had stopped his breathing once, but he'd been a boy then. She knew it wouldn't be enough for a man, so she had turned to her garden. She had years ago planted a small plot of cassava in her greenhouse and used it for her baking. The lined skin of the cassava felt as rugged as cypress knees, but the flesh, handled carefully, was a wonder to be fried or roasted or used in her baking. She took the time to learn how to prepare it safely. Cassava carried its poison in the coarse skin and the leaves, the parts exposed to the world. And perhaps that was how it should be, a shield to survive in a certain kind of world, to thrive even. To carry out Jojo's request, Rachel had saved what was meant to be discarded, the cyanide in the pot liquor, thickened with the starch of the root. During his trial, Thomas Elijah Raymond had been shuttled back and forth from the new county jail to the new courthouse. Depending on the road they took, he may have passed the hillside where Russell County did their lynching, out on a hill they named Golgotha. The name had confused Rachel when she heard those stories as a child. The killers had tried to sanctify their work, but it was nothing more than blasphemy. She knew that hilltop from the Easter hymns. New Testament scriptures, and the Sunday school books. 3 crosses. The bad thief cursed it all, and the good thief asked for grace and mercy. Thomas had asked her for the same, and she brought his grace and his mercy, and it floated there in the thick sweetness of her bottle, a dose large enough to claim his body. He would die that evening, but she wouldn't let them make a carnival of him. The spectators would have nothing to witness, because he could do his dying, make his peace, in private. She turned the dial on the oven to 350 degrees. The perishables she retrieved from the refrigerator. The other ingredients she opened, poured, and measured. The pans, greased and floured, lay waiting for the batter. When the time came, she turned on the mixer and listened to its baritone hum as it folded the necessary elements, one into the other. The story, The Good Thief, was first published in Alabama Noir and is read here by permission of the author. We hope you don't keep Alabama Aloud all to yourself. Subscribe to our podcast and share it with a friend. Better yet, write us a review in the iTunes store. It helps other people find the podcast. Also, give us a shout-out on social media. Alabama Aloud is a production of Troy Public Radio and produced by Austin Toy and Kyle Gessett. Special thanks to Matt Clower, Buddy Johnson, and Michelle Mowry. Alabama Aloud is made possible in part by a grant from Alabama State Council on the Arts. So, until next time, when you'll hear more of Alabama read aloud, I'm Don Noble. Thanks for listening.